Continuamos con las actividades del Congreso Internacional, Educación Judicial 2023, la especialización judicial más allá de las fronteras. En este momento, damos paso a la conferencia intitulada Uso del Derecho Comparado Inglés en el Razonamiento Jurídico, que será disertada por el doctor Bosko Tripkovic, a quien recibimos con un fuerte aplauso. En este momento se llevará a cabo la síntesis curricular.
Profesor asociado de la Universidad de Birmingham. Certificado de posgrado en Educación Superior por la Universidad de Birmingham. Doctor en Filosofía por el Instituto Universitario Europeo. Maestro en Derecho por el Instituto Universitario Europeo. Maestro en Filosofía y Maestro en Investigación por la Universidad de Novi Sad. Licenciado en Leyes por la Facultad de Derecho de Serbia.
Dentro de las distinciones más recientes que ha recibido, se encuentran la del Premio Mauro Capelliti, distinción y reconocimiento por la Revista Internacional de Derecho Constitucional en el año 2020 como uno de los 3 mejores artículos publicados en ICON 2019. Asimismo, tuvo un reconocimiento por el Instituto Universitario Europeo en el año 2016 por la tesis doctoral en Derecho Comparado defendida en 2015, considerada como una de las mejores.
Agradecemos la presencia del director del Centro de Investigaciones Judiciales de la Escuela Judicial del Estado de México, doctor Juan Carlos Abreu y Abreu, quien fungirá como presentador de esta conferencia y a quien cedemos el uso de la palabra.
Bien, pues muy agradecido de que me hayan invitado a estar aquí cerca presentando al doctor Tripkovic. No solo es me causa beneplácito no estar al lado de un gran académico joven y además de todo muy talentoso académico, sino que creo que trae un tema medular. Seré breve. Creo que es muy importante poner un poco de contexto sobre el por qué hablamos de derecho comparado. Creo que una de las fronteras más importantes que hemos tenido en la evolución de nuestro sistema jurídico mexicano se da a partir de la reforma de 2011 en materia de derechos humanos. Ello no solo nos empuja en el ámbito jurisdiccional y también en el ámbito académico del derecho a confrontar con otras experiencias de sistemas jurídicos de otras latitudes, sino además de todo a brevar de ellas. Máxime del modelo británico. No está de más ponerlo sobre la mesa, creo que es un dato que debemos tener a la mano. La reforma de 2021, aquella reforma integral al Poder Judicial de la Federación, incorpora la figura del precedente. Dicho sea de paso, nosotros somos la primera entidad federativa que incorpora precisamente la figura del precedente y la domesticamos, me refiero a hacerla doméstica, porque estamos ya prácticamente trabajando sobre ello. Los señores magistrados están trabajando no solo sus determinaciones en clave de precedente, sino de hecho ya tenemos publicado precedente en materia de prisión preventiva oficiosa. Esta coyuntura resulta ser fundamental, sobre todo porque si bien el precedente proviene de la familia jurídica anglosajona y ello para nosotros implica una importante limitación. Hay que recordar, en Occidente hoy las 2 grandes familias jurídicas son las del civil law, o sea, este derecho neorromanista que ocupa un lugar privilegiado. La legislación de alguna manera tiene distancias con el modelo anglosajón, el common law, ¿verdad? Que fundamentalmente su fuente generadora del derecho es la decisión judicial. Ahora, ¿y por qué tenemos que hablar de precedente? Conectando con lo que decía hace un momento, la necesaria argumentación, el necesario razonamiento, la justificación, implica la necesidad de observar modelos en los que, pues de alguna manera, hay cercanía con esta familia jurídica anglosajona. No quiero extenderme más, solamente poner de relieve que el derecho comparado hoy resulta ser una materia fundamental. Habíamos estado acostumbrados hace algún tiempo, la formación en las facultades de Derecho era encerrarse, enclaustrarse en el propio modelo jurídico. Hoy tenemos que abrirnos, hoy tenemos que ver con una mayor amplitud de horizontes. Quiero dejarlo hasta aquí. Bueno, no quiero hacer un señalamiento adicional. Precisamente de la escuela británica viene toda una formación, sobre todo a partir de la escuela de Cambridge, dejó pues, muy importantes teóricos que han favorecido a la argumentación jurídica. Me refiero, por ejemplo, a Toulmin, ¿verdad?, que de alguna forma de estar en Cambridge pasa a los Estados Unidos, y de ahí hemos tenido necesidad de abrevar estos autores de cuño anglosajón y fundamentalmente británico. Esta escuela analítica de Cambridge ha proveído de muchos elementos de los que ahora utilizamos como abogados, como académicos, como juzgadores en el ejercicio cotidiano del derecho. Ahora sí, lo dejo hasta aquí. No me quieren escuchar a mí, quieren escuchar al doctor Tripkovich. Entonces, si ustedes así lo determinan, lo dejamos en el uso de la palabra. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for that very warm welcome, and thanks to the organizers for organizing this amazing event and for their hospitality, and thanks to you for coming to listen to me. Now, I will stand up there because it's nearing midnight in my time zone, and I am in a danger of falling asleep, so I will try to entertain myself a little bit by standing up. So, as you have noticed, my topic today concerns the use of foreign law in judicial reasoning, and I will be mainly focusing on, as already has been said, on common law jurisdictions and how that practice occurs in common law jurisdictions, although I should say that I originally come from a civil law jurisdiction and consider it to be superior in many ways. I will try to refer to some of the concepts that might be more familiar to you. So what I want to talk about today, I want to talk about how judges may use foreign law in their reasoning, how that practice may be justified, what are the limits and some concerns about this practice if it's accepted unreflectively. And finally, I want to say a couple of things about what I think this practice of the use of foreign law in judicial reasoning means for judicial education, which is our topic today. So first, and this is the outline of my presentation. In the first part, I will talk about the concept of the use of foreign law and what I mean when I say the use of foreign law. My key argument here will be that foreign law, by the mere fact that it is used in judicial reasoning, does not become our own domestic law. And you will see in a moment why that is important, because some people think that the justification for the use of foreign law can neatly map certain ways in which we justify the use of domestic law. And I will argue that that is not the case. Secondly, I will distinguish between two ideal types of the way in which foreign law may be used, which I call the deductive model and the reflective model. And I will argue that the deductive model is not really justified and should be avoided, whereas the reflective model can be justified and can be used, but poses certain limits also on the way in which foreign law may be used. Then the key of my presentation will focus on how that reflective use of foreign law can actually be justified, and I will suggest that there are some virtues of good judgment which can be fostered or facilitated by the use of foreign law, and I will use some examples to show how that may be done. And then at the very end, I will finish with some concerns or limits or pitfalls of the use of foreign law, and if this practice is actually accepted, what would that mean in particular for judicial education, and how we may equip the courts and judges to be successful in their use of foreign law, should they wish to do so. Now, so what is the judicial use of foreign law? When I say judicial use of foreign law, what I mean is that it is a non-mandatory use of foreign law, meaning when I say non-mandatory, I wish to distinguish certain cases in which foreign law must be used. So for example, in classic conflicts of law scenarios, sometimes the courts may need to use foreign law and will be directed to do so by their domestic law. And this is not what I want to address today. I want to address the use of foreign law which is facultative, which comes from a certain wish of courts and judges to make their judgments better. And then when I say foreign law, I mean law of foreign jurisdictions, so excluding international law and even soft international law, because I think that the use of international law obviously poses different questions, and use of soft international law again poses certain different questions. So my focus is on the use of law from foreign jurisdictions, legislation, precedents, and so on. Yeah. So why am I focusing on this question? Why is this question important? And we heard already why it may be important. But there is a certain sense that the use of foreign law is on the rise, that it's increasing in numbers, in certain importance, significance, prominence, and so on. And I don't necessarily think that the use of foreign law is a new phenomenon, but it has gained a lot of attention. Yeah. It has gained a lot of attention, and also critical attention, because judges, as we see today, communicate in a globalized world, meet in conferences such as this one, exchange experiences and so on, and learn from each other. And that may prompt them to use foreign law or laws from other jurisdictions and so on. And then there is also an increasing sense that we share certain common legal frameworks, such as, after the Second World War, obviously the rise of human rights and guaranteeing human rights and national constitutions and so on. And these legal questions tend to be quite similar, so it becomes a little bit more natural for courts to look abroad for solutions when they're deciding cases. Now, as I said, foreign law has been used for centuries, and it's not new, but there are certain critiques of this practice, and we'll come to that a little bit later, and I think that this question really deserves to be discussed. Now, one way in which some people try to conceptualize the use of foreign law, to make sense of this practice, is to understand it as part and parcel of domestic law. And I here want to really distinguish this phenomenon from domestic law, because as you know, in domestic law, there is never a question of whether, as a judge, you are allowed not to use law. or that it is somehow within the limits of your authority to decide whether to use valid law or not. Yeah. Whereas with use of foreign law, it's facultative. Judges may use it or may not use it. Secondly, it's selective. The use of foreign law is selective, unlike domestic law, where you cannot simply ignore a complete area of law if you're deciding a case. Foreign law is very, very selective. It's used in some areas, in some other areas it is not used. The third thing is that there is no appeal, really, on the basis of the use of foreign law. You cannot appeal a judgment anywhere claiming that foreign law is not used or is used wrongly and so on, unlike domestic law. It's never a question of law. Yeah? And finally, foreign law tends to be used by courts which are higher in judicial hierarchy. No other branch of law is used only by some courts and not others, unless they are specialized courts. So it really does not resemble the way in which we think about domestic law. And why is that important? Because some people think that the use of foreign law can be justified by virtue of the same principles that justify the use of domestic law. So I come here to my puzzle today, and my puzzle is how can we justify this practice? How can we say that this practice is legitimate or allowed or a good idea? Because we have generally a good sense or understanding of the key ways in which we justify domestic law, why we ought to follow the law, apply it, and so on. Whereas with foreign law, that sort of justification is missing at the moment. And so there are two different ways in which the use of foreign law may be justified. The first one is what I call a content-independent justification. And this sort of justification is content-independent because it justifies the use of foreign law regardless of its content. Whether it's good or bad, it doesn't matter. Yeah? So, for example, some people think that some sort of integrity or principled consistency in application of law calls for the use of foreign law. And you can recognize this sort of justification from the case of domestic law, where we think that there is a good case in a reasonably just and democratic legal order to apply domestic law consistently. Yeah? But that argument doesn't really work across borders, because it is not that someone crossing a border has a legitimate expectation that the law in the country that they are entering will be the same as the law in the country they're coming from. Yeah? There is no expectation that it will be consistent. Or there may be some expectation, but in a very limited scenarios where we have fundamental questions of human dignity and so on. Yeah? Someone can expect to be treated with dignity, but someone cannot accept that the speed limit will be the same when they cross the border from US to Mexico and so on. And so that is the problem, really, with this sort of justification. Another sort of justification is that the use of foreign law increases democratic legitimacy. It allows minorities, so the argument goes, to use foreign law to broaden the scope of possible claims that they can make within a legal system. Sometimes minorities can be oppressed to the extent that they lack the vocabulary within the legal system to articulate their needs, their concerns, and so on. However, this sort of justification, again, is very limited. It depends on whether minorities are actually using foreign law to make these sorts of claims. And again, I don't think it's fully convincing. So I think that it is better for us to understand the use of foreign law and its justification in content-dependent terms. The idea of that sort of justification is that somehow foreign law leads to better judgments. It's all about the outcomes. Yeah? If judges use foreign law, their judgments somehow become better. Yeah? Now, but this is also puzzling. This is also puzzling. Why? Because the fact that someone else is doing something doesn't necessarily mean that you ought to do it too. Yeah? Probably many of us have been scolded by our parents for saying something like, oh, my friends did it too, yeah? And what would your parents say? They would say, well, that's not a justification, yeah? So how can we justify our actions by the fact that someone else is doing the same thing? And if we want to go a little bit deeper into this idea, the question is, how can empirical facts about foreign law reveal good moral judgment? Yeah. Because there is a discrepancy, this discrepancy that I just described, between facts and values. And so this is the key of my intervention today, to try to grapple with this problem, to understand how the use of foreign law can lead to better judgments. And I want to suggest that there are two distinct ways in which we may think that foreign law leads to better judgments. The first one I call the deductive model. Yeah. The deductive model basically treats foreign law as an authority. Yeah? So whatever foreign law says, we should do too. That is very roughly a simplified idea of this approach. And it doesn't matter what our own law says about the issue or what are the attitudes or experiences of our own legal system when we use foreign law. And I will say and argue later on that this sort of deductive view, again, is not justified. And then you have reflective model. Reflective model is the idea that the use of foreign law enables certain sort of reflection which is characteristic of good judgments, being reflective. Yeah? And I will try to spend a lot of time explaining what that means and how foreign law may lead to that sort of reflection without actually importing uncritically solutions from foreign law. Okay, so let's move on to the deductive model. Now, deductive model is important because it has led to a particular critique of the use of foreign law as a whole. And so I want to unpack it a little bit in terms of certain propositions that this deductive view accepts and to understand where the problem is. Yeah. So we can understand the deductive view in terms of three basic propositions. The first one is that somehow foreign solutions to our own legal dilemmas track or reveal moral values or some good solutions that we need to adopt. Yeah. Why then we accept these foreign solutions? Because we treat them as a sort of epistemic authority. I will explain later what that means, but in a way that that suggests that there is certain knowledge in foreign law which we can accept sort of uncritically. And then foreign law becomes independent of whatever our own law says, because our law can simply be wrong in relation to foreign law. So let us start with an example, and I'll walk you through the way in which this sort of reasoning operates. Yeah. So the first idea is that the normative weight or the value of foreign law is somehow independent from domestic moral attitudes. And the most clear example of this is reliance on foreign consensus. Judges sometimes say, oh, look, there is consensus in foreign law about this issue. We should accept it too. Yeah? So, for example, Justice Kennedy in a famous case, Roper versus Simmons, which concerned whether juvenile death penalty in the United States is constitutional, said the United States is the only country in the world that continues to give official sanction to the juvenile death penalty. Yeah. meaning that there is some sort of normative pool. If we are the only ones doing this, then we probably are in a certain way wrong about it. And obviously they are wrong, but that conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from the fact that the whole world is doing something. Yeah. So the second idea is that as I said, foreign law acquires sort of epistemic authority in legal and moral issues. Yeah. What does it mean for something to be an authority? It means that it has independent normative weight. So it is not the fact that it is a good idea to abolish death penalty for minors, and that is why we should abolish it. But it is the idea that foreign law says something, and in virtue of that fact, we should abolish death penalty for minors. So two distinct ways of reasoning about this. And foreign law, in a sense, acquires a role of a moral expert. Yeah? When we are dealing with experts, we rely on their authority. The most used example is the examples of medical doctors. Yeah? If I'm not a medical doctor and I'm ill, and if I go and they tell me something, I accept their authority. Why do I accept their authority? Because they know better than I do. Yeah. And so the same idea is here somehow applied in this deductive view. Somehow foreign consensus knows better. Yeah. And now why would that be the case? Well, for this to work, really, foreign consensus would somehow need to track moral values. In the same way that sciences discover how the world is like, foreign consensus is sort of discovering what is the best solution for any sort of legal problem. And you have people making these sorts of arguments that foreign consensus is very similar to scientific consensus about how the world is like. Now, we know that scientific consensus can, of course, be questioned and overturned and changes all the time. But I would like to suggest that foreign law and foreign consensus is very much unlike scientific consensus. Yeah? And let us see why. There simply isn't the analogy with sciences. In law, we are not discovering what the world is like. We are creating norms that should guide people's behaviors. There simply isn't guarantee that foreign law will track best moral solutions. So, for example, I'll give you one example, and it will become clear why. So, Justice Daniel, in the infamous decision, Dred Scott versus Sandford, said, well, look, slavery seems to be legal and morally approved in most countries. That means that slavery is constitutional. Yeah? So you see how dangerous it can be to think that foreign consensus acquires some sort of authority. Yeah. And I suggest that foreign consensus, for this reason, should be rejected as a sort of authority. It can carry certain weight, don't get me wrong, and we'll come back to that when we talk about the reflective view, but it cannot be unreflectively accepted as some sort of authority. Okay, let's go to the reflective view. This is the model that I think can be justified. So we'll first explain its elements. Then I will show how it can build a connection between foreign law and some idea of good judgment. And then I will finish by drawing attention to certain limits. If we accept that reflective view of the use of foreign law is viable or justified, then we also need to accept that there are some limits to it as well, and we probably need to rethink a little bit how legal education is structured. Yeah. So the reflective model, in the reflective model, foreign law becomes relevant by virtue of three key ideas. The first idea is that foreign law enables judges to reach better judgments. The second is that foreign law does not acquire authority in the same way that when we talked about consensus. It does not acquire authority in legal matters. And the third is that the judgment of the court ultimately depends on domestic law or domestic opinions or domestic attitudes or domestic experiences. Yeah. Now let's start from the third element, because it is very easy to see that the judges who actually use foreign law hold this view, that judgment of the court ultimately depends on domestic law and domestic attitudes. So you have Aharon Barak, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Israel, saying, even when comparative law is consulted, the final decision must always be local. Yeah. Justice O'Connor from the US Supreme Court says the existence of an international consensus can serve to confirm the reasonableness of a consonant and genuine American consensus. So they're all denying that foreign law is somehow imported in an authoritative way into their own legal system. The decision remains local and based on local laws and traditions. Now, coming to the second element, foreign law does not acquire authority or independent moral weight. So you have Laurie Ackerman, former Justice of the South African Constitutional Court, saying that foreign law never has authority binding on one's own decision. Again, Aharon Barak says that foreign law is never binding. Ruth Bader Ginsburg from the US says that foreign opinions are not authoritative and that they set no binding precedent. And then Justice Breyer, also from the US, says that they are useful even though not binding. So they're all rejecting this idea that they're importing foreign solutions, and yet they still use foreign law. So how is that possible? That is my puzzle really here. And the idea is that foreign law enables them to reach better moral judgments. Better moral judgments, and I know, lots of you are judges. I think we can agree that judges in 95% of the cases can simply apply the law. Again, going to the example of the speed limit, I don't have to think about much whether I violated the speed limit. Yeah? There is no scope for interpretation there. There may be sometimes, but in 90% of the cases there isn't. But there is a 10% of cases where judges exercise some sort of discretion and try to make the best possible decision with the resources they have. But that law doesn't really get them far enough to make that judgment. So the idea is that within the scope of discretion, foreign law somehow enables better moral judgments. Now, again, this is puzzling. Why is it puzzling? Because there are two hurdles that this argument needs to pass. The first hurdle is how can facts about foreign law reveal something or make moral judgments better? We said the example of you not washing your hands when you were little and your parents telling you that the fact that your friends didn't do it doesn't count as a justification. So they need to somehow bridge that gap. And then the second thing is, hang on a minute, if you're basing your decision on domestic law, then why do you need foreign law? Yeah? So you need to bridge the gap between decision being based somehow on foreign law, but ultimately dependent on what your domestic law is saying. And so now my key argument here is that there are some virtues of good judgment or good moral judgment where foreign law can play a role which satisfies these conditions, that it is not imported as an authority and that the decision remains local. Yeah. The first one would be information. To make a good judgment, you need to rely on good empirical evidence about something, but you may not have that empirical evidence. For example, in Roe v. Wade, the argument was that mortality rates in abortion are the same or lower as in regular childbirth. So they did not decide to protect the life of the mother based on that. Why? They looked at foreign law and saw evidence from jurisdictions where abortion was allowed and saw that empirical evidence shows that the mortality rate is about the same or lower. Yeah. So they're not importing moral judgment. They're importing empirical evidence. They're treating foreign legal systems as a sort of live experiments, and source of knowledge about certain pieces of information that may be missing in their own system. The second virtue of good judgment, I would argue, is flexibility. And I want to suggest that reliance or looking at foreign law can lead to greater flexibility. And flexibility means questioning and re-examining the domestic laws. So again, an example is Lawrence versus Texas, and overturning a previous decision in Bowers versus Hardwick, which found that homosexual relations, consensual homosexual relations, should not be allowed under the American Constitution. And in Lawrence, the court overturned that decision. They say, well, still this decision is local, but they try to show that the argument in Bowers was based on foreign law, but the way in which foreign law was used was selective and was neglecting certain important parts of culture of the systems that were compared, and that the conclusion doesn't really follow. So judges can somehow use foreign law to increase the sensitivity to certain perspectives or opinions which are already embedded in the legal system and make them more visible. Yeah. So that is another virtue where foreign law may become important. The next, again, closely connected, is coherence. We can again use the same pair of cases, such as Lawrence versus Texas and Bowers versus Hardwick. The idea in Lawrence wasn't to import foreign law, it was to bring domestic commitments, domestic legal commitments into better balance. Yeah? So what foreign law has done there is to raise the awareness about certain elements of the domestic legal system which have been neglected in the previous case, and to bring them back into some sort of coherence. Another example, Justice Barak again, and I'm mentioning these judges because, and one and the same judges quite often, because they're the ones that tend to rely on foreign law and sort of justify why they're doing that. So in that case, Adelach versus Minister of Interior, the question was constitutionality of an outright ban of granting residency or permits or citizenship to family members of the residents, to Israeli, family members of Israeli citizens who are residents in occupied territories. And Justice Barak said, well, all countries that guarantee human dignity also guarantee the right to family life. And sort of argued, well, Israel also guarantees human dignity, and so it also ought to protect family rights. Yeah. And so he derived the right to family life as a fundamental right by making this argument. He didn't say, oh, we should just do the same as everyone else. He said that this is already a value, human dignity is already a value which is fundamental in Israeli constitutional system. And we just need to bring into balance different parts of legal framework. But foreign law enabled him to see where certain commitments haven't been fulfilled to the extent that they should be fulfilled. Again, we had imagination mentioned today. That's another virtue of good judgment. And it means sort of overcoming tunnel vision and seeking creative solutions. No one expects judges to know everything, or they may be faced with certain arguments in the course of a legal proceeding. But they may as well look at foreign law to see what sorts of arguments are used there, and then reject them if they don't find them convincing, or accept the reasoning behind them, not just judgments, but the reasoning behind them. So, for example, in South Africa, this used to happen quite often, especially in the post-apartheid constitution, because there just wasn't enough experience with deciding cases on certain issues from a liberal democratic legal framework. And then you had judgment in S versus McMahon, where foreign authorities were used to see what are the arguments for and against death penalty, and whether there should be death penalty in South Africa. And so they discussed the obvious ones, arguments from justice, from deterrence, from public opinion, and all sorts of arguments, because they didn't really know what the arguments would be. But they rejected some of them and they accepted the reasoning behind some of them, but they did not import foreign law directly. Finally, and connected to this, one virtue of good judgment is maturity and overcoming the lack of experience. There's simply new areas of law or new questions that are posed in systems which do not have the experience of dealing with these sorts of questions. And again, the examples in South Africa. They did not have experience at the moment, and they used foreign law to kind of get up to speed with that sort of experience, particularly in the early stages of the transition, where they didn't have a well-developed indigenous jurisprudence. I mean, some of the things that we talked about today, such as the use of AI and so on, no one has experience with that, no one. And then you need to look abroad to see, well, what have others found out? You don't need to base your decision on foreign law, but it would be unwise not to draw on any sort of source of experience that you may have in a very new legal problem. Yeah. Another virtue of good judgment is openness. Yeah. So openness means being open about different possibilities and solution. And this really stands sometimes in contrast with the virtue of maturity. Yeah, some systems think, well, we are really mature. We have figured it all out. We have so much jurisprudence on this issue. But if they're not open, then the problem becomes how the law fits the needs of their contemporary society. I mean, the example is the United States. Yeah? If you have a stable legal and constitutional system for very long, that it can ossify certain views which no longer fit the needs of the society. And so you need to look elsewhere. And what I want to also suggest is that to be really open, if you're using foreign law, you need to take into account a wide range of jurisdictions. A wide range of jurisdictions. Not but just look at what your friends are saying and people that you agree with, but also exposing yourself to views of those that disagree with you and trying to tackle their arguments somehow and see what are your own basic commitments of your system and why you cannot accept other solutions. So again, example is Justice Breyer in Knight versus Florida. He was looking at Zimbabwe in that case, and then later on he made a comment, oh, that was a tactical mistake, because he was attacked. Why are we looking at Zimbabwe, fear the US, and so on? No, you exactly need to look at these sorts of systems which may be dissimilar to yours, to learn about yourself. Yeah? because otherwise you think you know everything, but you don't. And final two virtues would be sensibility, what I call sensibility, which means seeing the problem from the perspective of others and incorporating their point of view. A good judge knows how to put themselves in the shoes of others, of parties to the case. Parties to the case sometimes may come to you as a judge because they just want to have their case heard, but they do believe that they're right, that they have certain needs or interests which need to be protected by legal system, as well as the other side. And so really, good judging kind of requires putting yourselves in shoes of others. Again, Walras versus Hardwick, Lawrence versus Texas. So the question in Walras was, is there a right to engage in homosexual relations? But that sort of question already neglects the experience of an important minority. And so Lawrence court used foreign law and realized, well, the question that they posed was not a good question. The question is whether the state has a legitimate interest to interfere with the relations of homosexuals in their private lives. So they changed the question. They realized, no, the question was wrong. How they realized that? Well, they looked at foreign law and how other jurisdictions dealt with a similar issue. And finally, another virtue of good judgment is clarity. As a judge, you need to articulate yourselves clearly. And sometimes foreign law can help with that because they have done something like that. A good example is the spread of proportionality analysis around the world, which doesn't tell you anything almost about the outcome of a legal case, but consists of stages that you need to go through in justifying limitations to fundamental rights. And why this doctrine has spread all around the world? Because judges found it useful. They didn't just take foreign law and say, no, they're right, we are just going to do the same. But they saw, well, this is useful because it makes our judgments much clearer. Okay, now I have made the case that there are good reasons for judges to use foreign law in this reflective way, which does not rely on foreign law as a source of authority and which respects the domestic legal system. Now, there are some concerns and limits to this sort of use of foreign law. Judges may think that they improved their moral judgment, but that comes at the expense of their legitimacy. In cases where you have clear legislation saying something, a constitution saying something, the population being of a particular view, then the judicial legitimacy kind of becomes fragile if judges use foreign law, because it neglects a little bit the democratic legitimacy of the legislator. Connected to this is that if foreign law is used in this reflective way, then it can only have a limited transformative potential. Why? Because the question remains always domestic legal question, which is enriched by the use of foreign law, but does not depend on foreign law. So there cannot be groundbreaking change which does not have already some sort of basis in the domestic law on this reflective model. And finally, of course, the use of foreign law can lead to certain reflective virtues, but there are also certain vices of the use of foreign law, such as, again, treating it as an authority that we talked about in the beginning, but also in terms of cherry-picking foreign law, misunderstanding foreign law, not properly researching the context in which foreign law applies, and so on. I am not of the view that you need to learn the language, live in a country for 50 years, and only then you can speak about its law. Yeah, that would prevent any sort of communication. But there is a certain limit to the analysis of foreign law that you can just do very quickly in a sort of off-the-cuff way. So what I'm suggesting is that if judges are to use foreign law, they need to explain why exactly foreign law made their judgment better. They can do that by connecting it with some of the reflective virtues and showing how exactly that particular jurisdiction deals with the problem and why that jurisdiction has been chosen as an example in their judgments. I'll give you an example. If you want to improve on the maturity of legal system, then you probably need to look at more mature legal systems or legal systems with more experience in a particular area. If you want to enrich the openness of a judgment, then you probably cannot just look at the systems which are very, very similar to yours, but you need to look at systems which are quite different, and that needs to be justified somehow. Now, the key question then for today, and this is where I may learn from you, or I will for sure learn from you more in your questions, is how do we frame legal education and judicial education in a world that is increasingly globalized and where foreign law is used more and more and more. I would like to suggest that some sort of training, basic training in comparative law analysis needs to be a part of the basic curriculum in a law degree, and that some reference to foreign law or comparative law should potentially be embedded in the way we teach traditional legal subject, such as torts, contracts, constitutional law, administrative law. And I'm sure, and we'll come back to the theme of the UK and common law, from my experience, that sort of education is much better done in civil law systems, and they tend to be very much oriented towards comparative law and have that sensitivity for doing things comparatively. Whereas some systems, such as the ones that I know, the UK and the US, tend to be much closer, much more closed, much more oriented towards their own laws, and so on. And I would like to see that change, because if this is happening, then clearly lawyers need to know how to deal with that. That also goes for judges and judicial clerks who need to be well versed in these kinds of matters, because the experience of using foreign law can be really enriching, but if not done properly, it can really lead to loads of problems in terms of the legitimacy of the judgments that are being made. Okay, let me at the end then just briefly summarize the key points I made today. I have presented the use of foreign law as a problem that requires justification, that where justification of that practice is not quite as obvious as it may seem. I suggested that that justification needs to explain how the use of foreign law leads to better legal judgments. I have then made a distinction between the deductive view, which treats foreign law in an authoritative way and is not justified in my view, and the reflective view, which allows foreign law to enrich the reflective value of judgments, but it does not treat foreign law as authoritative, and I suggested that it can be justified. Then I explained how this process of the use of foreign law works and how justification can be found with reference to reflective virtues that I talked about, and how these reflective virtues can guide the way in which foreign law is actually used, and how foreign jurisdiction can be compared and selected and why. Yeah. And so I finished with some brief thoughts about what that means for legal and judicial education, and suggested that more comparative law training, both in law curriculum and in judicial education, may help judges use foreign law in a more reflective and a more self-conscious way. Thank you very much for your attention, for staying until the end. I very much look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Bien, estamos a la espera de que existan algún tipo de preguntas por parte de quienes nos acompañan en el auditorio. Allá atrás hay una. Bueno, mientras revisamos las cuestiones técnicas, hay algunas reflexiones que me gustaría poner sobre la mesa, incluso para detonar posiblemente algunos cuestionamientos, algunas preguntas. Creo que el ejercicio académico que realiza de forma personal el profesor Kripovich tiene que ver con esto a lo que deberíamos eventualmente aspirar, ¿no? Hace un momento hablé de la importancia, de la relevancia del precedente incorporado como figura a nuestro proceso. Creo que nos queda claro que el bloque de constitucionalidad abrió una puerta muy importante, efectivamente, para ser receptivos a una serie de elementos legales, instrumentales en materia de derechos humanos. Este conocimiento, esta transición que tuvo que hacer el profesor Kripovich, él es serbio, como ustedes escucharon, el modelo jurídico de su país es muy parecido, está dentro del modelo del civil law, y como vieron ustedes, los ejemplos sobre los que fue trabajando fueron sobre sentencias del derecho anglosajón, ¿correcto? Esto nos insta, esto nos llama a quienes continuamente estudiamos el derecho, no solo los estudiantes de las universidades, sino los que trabajamos en el ámbito académico y en el ámbito jurisdiccional, efectivamente a buscar esta relación de creación del derecho, de fuente del derecho dentro de las sentencias judiciales. Creo que estamos viendo aquí la muestra de cómo eventualmente van a modificarse nuestros modos de aprender y de enseñar el derecho. Acudir hacia la casuística y que la casuística nos vaya informando sobre estos afluentes, estas fuentes sobre las cuales debemos abrevar para tomar nuestras propias reflexiones. ¿Quedó solucionado el problema ya? Perfecto.
Sí,
vamos a la pregunta.
Sí. Gracias. Muy interesante la ponencia del doctor, bien como lo acaba de referir. Usted efectivamente se refirió muchísimo más a cómo debe aplicarse el derecho comparado a sentencias en la figura del juez. Mi pregunta es si el derecho comparado permite su empleo en todas las áreas del derecho, ¿de qué manera este mismo derecho puede emplearse no solo en la figura del juez o del fiscal, sino también en la figura del defensor. ¿Cómo podría yo aplicar ese derecho comparado? Gracias.
Thank you very much for that question. Sorry, I need to turn this off. So I'm listening to the Spanish translation. So I think that's a very, very good question because it broadens the horizon of what I talked about today, because obviously I focused on courts, and this is my mistake now. I come from a common law system and we're obsessed with courts. But of course, legislators can also use it, and lawyers as well in their submissions. Now, there is a danger there. There is a danger in this particular context where you're moving to a system where you will have precedents, and that will necessarily lead to a massive increase in the workload, because if all lawyers start submitting precedents, say in the state of Mexico from everywhere else, that will be unmanageable. Now, if you imagine lawyers starting to submit precedents from all around the world, that will just be impossible for the court to handle. And I think that part of the reason why certain courts have traditionally been reluctant to use foreign law is precisely because of that possibility, that the gates would be open then for them to examine precedents from all around the world. So in the US, in the systems that I have examined, lawyers would rarely rely on foreign law directly. Also because there is a perception that if a judge is using foreign law, it means they are making new law. Yeah, why? Because if they had their own law, they wouldn't be using foreign law. And so judges are actually quite reluctant to allow that gate to open. And where you would normally find references to foreign law would be in amicus briefs. So people intervening in the process from a side, and they can be a little bit more open in what they submit, because lawyers would tend to be very, very cautious about inviting the court to make new law, because no court wants to make new law, even in common law systems where they officially, it's recognized that they make law. They will do all they can not to appear to be doing so. And so I think, and they're quite cautious also in the way they use foreign law, precisely not to open up the possibility for them to have to know all cases all around the world.
Quisiera yo meter un poco la cuchara, añadir, la pregunta resulta ser igual muy importante. No se reduce a la utilización por parte del juez el derecho comparado. Quiero que tomemos en cuenta que el cambio de paradigma procesal que tuvimos rumbo a la oralidad, por un lado, y luego la incorporación de la figura del precedente, nos permiten que el propio abogado litigante tenga una función persuasiva con el juzgador de su causa. No sé si estoy acercándome a una respuesta. Por eso creo, y sí, de alguna manera, aderezando lo que decía el profesor, es fundamentalmente en todos los ámbitos del derecho deberíamos nosotros incorporar mecanismos, esquemas, metodologías de derecho comparado, ¿no? ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta? Más bien debe haber algunas otras preguntas por ahí. Sí, luego vamos acá.
Buenas tardes a todos. Doctor Bosco, lo felicito por su excelente presentación de Derecho Comparado y la aplicación en la metodología. Lo felicito de veras porque manejó usted muy bien lo que es el método deductivo e inductivo. Aquí también en México tenemos excelentes metodólogos. Exactamente en el Estado de México tenemos a Dion Martínez, profesor de la Universidad Autónoma del Estado de México, ¿Y qué decir de Hernández Sampieri también? Lo interesante aquí es que cuando usted maneja, se va del método inductivo al deductivo y al revés, moviendo las variables, que si empiezo por el método inductivo, estoy hablando de lo general a lo particular, y llega usted precisamente a las particularidades de la aplicación del derecho, donde podríamos decir que si ya tengo particularidades y aplicando este mismo método me voy de lo particular a lo general, y esas particularidades nos llevarían al método, ya me bajé al deductivo, a lo particular, a lo deductivo, y luego me voy al inductivo, y esas particularidades, en mi opinión, a ver si podemos consensar, serían, por ejemplo, las jurisprudencias, que sabemos que tenemos 5 resoluciones en el mismo sentido, y que a propósito, hablando de un derecho comparado, en México ya también tenemos, en el Estado de México, podemos crear jurisprudencia. Aplicando ese mismo método, podríamos consensar que podemos ir de lo deductivo a lo inductivo y de lo inductivo a lo deductivo. Muchas gracias, doctor Bosco. Perdón, soy Maurilio Martínez, maestro de la UAM, y también doy clases de metodología.
Well, thank you so much for that comment. Yeah, I just can wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying, and this is generally, I think, I mean, you're absolutely right. This is the way in which reasoning works quite often in legal judgments. I would maybe just add that I suppose the difference that I wanted to draw attention to is what plays the role of the major premise in the deductive, and that cannot be the fact that someone said something and that someone doesn't have normally justified authority in a legal system. Obviously, in a legal system, we know that there are multiple ways in which we can justify legal authority and explain why we ought to follow the law. Talked about some of them today. One is some sort of principled integrity connected to the rule of law, and the other one is democratic legitimacy, and also the quality of the domestic law in terms of whether it is just and so on. But we lack similar justification from foreign law, and then when the foreign law plays the role of the major premise in the deductive sort of reasoning, that only then the deductive becomes problematic. So just to clarify, what I wanted to say is that I'm not against deductive reasoning in general, but in the case where foreign law is taken to be the major premise, the facts about foreign law. Thank you so much for the comment.
Quisiera adicionar lo siguiente. Tenemos una gran preocupación porque se siga pensando que el modelo deductivo es el aplicable ahora a la realidad del sistema jurídico mexicano. Y efectivamente de lo que debemos claudicar es de la mera deducción, porque la manera tradicional de entender el derecho para nosotros era la aplicación de la norma, la fundamentación, la aplicación de la norma que cayera en el hecho jurídico que se estaba revisando. La tendencia de la jurisprudencia contemporánea en México, no solo a nivel federal, sino a nivel local, tiende hacia buscar la analogía, no a buscar la mera subsunción. Por subsunción entendemos esta forma lógica de adecuar el hecho jurídico a lo que está contenido en la norma. Creo que es uno de los elementos que el profesor Kripovich había señalado. Su visión era crítica hacia el modelo deductivo, ¿no? Yo quisiera hacer hincapié en esto. Su visión era crítica porque efectivamente no puede aplicarse bajo ese rasero, bajo esa condición, no puede aplicarse la aproximación al derecho comparado.
I just, if I can add to that, I completely agree. And the sort of traditional reasoning will come under a lot of pressure in a situation when you're moving to the precedential system and the role of I think that there was, well, I don't know Mexican system at all, so apologies if I make a mistake. I can speak about other civil law systems. Analogies always played a role, maybe not so openly, but they were there. But now, as you said, that sort of reasoning will become a paradigm, yeah? And better to be prepared for it. Yeah?
Otra pregunta, allá había una.
Hola, muy buena tarde. Nada más para tal vez concluir de manera personal, estaría entonces en el derecho internacional, de primera mano sería para aumentar la dogmática o el acervo cultural a la hora de iniciar un procedimiento, digo, abriendo la puerta para algo más en el futuro, ¿no? Como dice el doctor, no hacerlo de manera análoga, sino poniendo en específico cada uno de los puntos. No sé, lo llevo desde el common law a México, decir, por esto pongo el ejemplo y pongo los puntos específicos. Creo que entonces para mí sería de manera inmediata ponerlo como un aumento de la dogmática que serviría de manera personal para abrir la puerta a algo más amplio, digamos, a la postre en el proceso judicial o bueno, en el proceso legal. No sé si sería eso.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely right, and I think your point about being serious about the context and enriching the local legal experience through that sort of engagement, one really needs to be serious about using comparative law, because if one is not serious, then one falls in the trap of just finding precedents which are supporting their own views. Now, I have to make a footnote here that my own presentation does exactly what I'm preaching that people should not do, simply because it was very short and I just picked certain cases from certain jurisdictions without giving you any context. So in a sense, I'm setting a very bad example of how this should be done. But I suppose that my point still got across that one needs to engage with foreign law with some sort of seriousness, which doesn't need to be limiting in a sense, because people who are doing comparative law as their research area sometimes would tell you that it's impossible to compare laws. Yeah? It is almost as if you really need to take it in law, take it in with mother's milk, as it were, and you don't understand it otherwise. I don't think that's the case, but you need to. But there is a strong argument for doing it in a slightly more serious way than some courts were doing it. Yeah.
Sí, quisiera yo abonar al planteamiento. Yo creo que eventualmente no significa claudicar, pero sí ir en una tarea de dilución de la visión de la dogmática rumbo a una de corte hermenéutica. Lo que está sugiriendo precisamente nuestro expositor tiene que ver con ello, con transitar hacia una visión más interpretativa, más hermenéutica, más abierta y menos dogmática. No sé si voy a solventar, y digo, añadiendo ahí el planteamiento. ¿No? ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Tenemos un expositor de maravilla, el tema es apasionante, me llama la atención que no hayan detonado por ahí alguna que otra inquietud más. Por favor, estamos en la mejor disposición de escuchar. Bien, estamos prácticamente a unos 10 minutos de concluir con el horario oficial y quisiera simplemente cerrar con un breve comentario, con el agradecimiento en primer término. Creo que lo correcto es dar el agradecimiento. No sé si hay alguna otra cosa que adicionar.
I would just like to add that I think it's good practice to finish on time and try to finish early, especially in the last session, and that I will be here around, and if you have questions, we can talk over lunch, over coffee, and so on. So please do feel free to engage, because that is why I'm here, and that is what I would like to do. So thank you very much for staying this late and for your attention, for your questions, and I'm sure I will talk to some of you tomorrow. Thank you.
Pues aprovechenlo, va a andar por aquí. Si lo ven por los pasillos, tacléenlo y háganle la pregunta. Muchas gracias, que tengan buenas tardes.
Agradecemos la brillante participación de nuestro conferencista. En este momento se hará entrega de un merecido reconocimiento, así como de un obsequio por su destacada disertación al doctor Boško Tripković. A continuación, el maestro Óscar Fernando Castañeda Bastida, investigador de la Escuela Judicial del Estado de México, hace entrega de un merecido reconocimiento, así como de un obsequio al doctor Juan Carlos Abreu y Abreu por su destacada participación. En este momento se llevará a cabo una toma de fotografía. Agradecemos al doctor Boško Tripković y al doctor Juan Carlos Abreu con un fuerte aplauso.